Hi everyone, thanks for clicking in and listening to the Sustainable Cannabis Coalition podcast. Our podcasts are a series of roundtable discussions with industry luminaries that tackle trends and sustainable practices within the fast-growing cannabis industry. I'm your host, Dana Hillman, VP of Business Development for Grow IQ. For this episode, we'll be talking sustainability in the context of the cannabis industry with none other than guests from one of our founding members of the SEC, Cohn Reznick. So if you're in the cannabis space, Cohn Reznick is practically a household name. They're one of the nation's largest and most innovative advisory, assurance, and tax firms, and they have deep knowledge in the cannabis sector. So we're really lucky to have them. And today from Cohn Reznick, we have Ira Weinstein, Managing Principal for their cannabis practice, Tama Huang, their Chief Innovation Officer, and their special guest, Gail Rand, who is CEO of Grand Consulting, and certainly no stranger to the cannabis industry herself. So thanks everybody for agreeing to take a break from your pandemic Zoom calls and share your thoughts on sustainability and what it means for the cannabis industry.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Dana. Wonderful to be here.
Absolutely. So as always, I'd like to give our listeners a chance to hear about you and your backgrounds, add a little bit of context. So if you don't mind, let's go around the horn quickly. And we'll start with Ira, then Tama and Gail. And if you would share a little bit about your background, that would be great. So Ira, you start off.
Thanks, Dana. Really appreciate the introduction and really appreciate participating in the coalition. Excited for what's ahead with not just this podcast, but everything that's to follow. I think this is going to be a really wonderful initiative. I've been with Cohn Reznick for 23 years, and I come to the organization with more of a kind of consulting finance background, less so on the kind of pure accounting side. And we've done some really interesting and I think entrepreneurial things over the years, including our foray into the cannabis space. And I'm privileged now to play a role in helping to bring some of our services to market. And I get to work on a regular basis with Tama and Gail. So I'm excited for this conversation.
Yeah, me too. Tama?
Yes, thanks, Dana and Ira. Tama Huang, I am the Chief Innovation Officer at Cohn Reznick. It's a role that's actually new for the firm and one that was created just in light of all of us understanding that the things that got us here are not going to get us there, and that there's a pivot that needs to take place, not just in terms of, the way we look at technology, improving data literacy, but just a body language change of leaning into the future and becoming more responsible all around. I am excited to be in this role. I'm excited to be here today.
Thanks a lot. Really appreciate it. Gail, a little bit about yourself would be great.
Thank you so much for having me and also for forming the coalition. I think sustainability is going to be a key to the success and the future of cannabis. So it's very exciting to be part of this. I'm working with Cohn Reznick and have been for a year to help them grow their cannabis practice. Through Grand Consulting, I also help several other clients throughout the country grow their business with a real nod to understanding their financials. Prior to that, I was the co-founder and chief financial officer of Forward Grow, which is the first licensed medical cannabis company in Maryland. And I also helped with passing of the medical cannabis bill in Maryland for my son, Logan, who suffers from epilepsy and autism. Thank you again for having me.
That's great, Gail. And I appreciate the fact that you have a personal connection with this space. That's great. For those of you who aren't familiar with the cannabis industry, when it comes to tax, accounting, regulation, it's an understatement to say that it's challenging. It's just complicated. And that said, sustainability is fast growing, or at least fast becoming, an important aspect of everybody's business plan these days, and many just aren't prepared to tackle. So Ira, you're one of the pros in the field. So I'm really interested in your thoughts on sustainability, specifically as it relates to the cannabis industry, and also the fact that you're one of the founding members of the SEC. How did Cohn Reznick get here? And what I mean by that is how you go about tackling the notion of sustainability in a market that's still viewed as the wild, wild west.
Yeah, thanks, Dana. It's a great question. I think to understand how we got here, probably helpful to give a little bit of background on our approach to and desire to get into the cannabis industry in the first place. I think when people think about a firm like ours, professional services that are so heavy on the accounting side, they think of things like transparency and disclosure, standards, regulations, data, systems, kind of all the things that get associated. And we looked at the cannabis industry and said, all that's necessary. And it's really important to give some structure to the extent that it is the wild, wild west. And
Yeah.
the 4 years in, it's still perceived that way. I think that for us, though, maybe the biggest issue was the extent to which, as an organization culturally, the notion of sustainability, if we think about it more broadly as kind of ESG, and we think about all three of those letters, the environmental, the social, and governance, we feel like that's critical not only to us as an organization, but to all of the folks we support in the marketplace. And to Tama's point earlier, to trying to create something that has the staying power and the ability to withstand all of the changes we experience and to take us to that better place. And the cannabis industry seemed literally ripe for that. It required all of these areas of focus where we could help translate, and I think translating is a role we play, the sort of operational to the financial to the social. And cannabis is, I think, an industry that's born out of a real social consciousness, a need to sort of change the trajectory of what was a war on drugs for maybe a lot of the wrong reasons, people that were disproportionately affected, the extent to which it's, medical at its core. The plant has all these healing powers, and that there's so much value to it that it felt to us a lot like other industries we've been involved in. And we've seen the trajectory there and how the notion of sustainability, whether you define that as literally the sustainability of the product you're creating or the sustainability of the organization that you're creating, there needs to be the sort of infrastructure to make that possible. And that what that does, obviously, then is it allows for a future that is really valuable, a market that's larger and more efficient, and one hopefully that's inclusive. And so those aspects really made us focus long and hard on this. Our largest industry is real estate, specifically affordable housing. Very similar trajectory in terms of just what happens and how you get to the notion of sustainability, both as a real estate product and as a real estate organization. And as we march through that sort of progression, we've seen some amazing things that we thought we could analogize to cannabis. We've seen similar things in industries like renewable energy. We were early adopters there and got into that and saw a similar trajectory around some of the same ideas, that sort of ESG aspect. And we felt like this was an opportunity for us to play a really unique role. And the fact that it's so early in the life cycle was particularly attractive, but we also appreciated the challenges of being early. And I like the fact that if you get into that conversation early around sustainability, I think even though it feels like we've got a long way to go, we haven't been at it that long. So I think the fact that we're having this conversation is really powerful.
I think, Ira, you touch on something that to me is truly unique, both in terms of the industry and the maturity trajectory of this industry, as you described. We're early on, and we have an opportunity, and in my opinion, also a responsibility to continuously calibrate and get this onto the right trajectory. And to me, the S is probably the place where we are least mature, and that is because the measurements and the metrics are not as clearly defined as they are with the E. And if I step back and look at the industry today, I'm gonna say that you started with kind of the illicit use, and historically looking back, a tremendous amount of that was in the shadows, affecting disproportionately a segment of our population. that is not as involved today, both from a operator perspective as well as from an investor perspective, in the money-making aspect of the industry now that it has come out of the shadows. And what I mean to say by that is that it really, we've punished a segment of our population, and I'm going to be explicit, right? The darker skinned, black and brown population, and we're rewarding now, obviously, right, the entrepreneurs, the folks that are connected to capital. I think we have to take a real close look at that and say, what is our moral obligation? What is our responsibility to ensure equity?
Yeah, I think you're right, Tom. I think that we are. The good news is that conversation is taking place. We're talking about it here. I think it's being talked about, at least in the efforts being made in every state around social equity and efforts at the federal level. So I think there's a government role to play. I think I agree with you, there's a responsibility among folks in the industry. And I really believe that a lot of folks take it seriously. The question really will be, how do we take it seriously beyond just having a conversation, and what can we do to move that along? I actually think this notion of sustainability, when you get into the technical side and some of the elements of what will be the economic development of sustainability, when you think of how to deal literally with the cultivation practices, I think that is among the most powerful ways to try and increase the opportunity to be more inclusive. Because I think if we can grow this from an economic development perspective, I think that will hopefully be both colorblind and create much greater opportunity and capacity building, if you will, for everybody.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And thanks, Tama. That's a topic that's very deserving of bringing to the forefront. But, I'm particularly interested in your background specifically, too, because one of the things, at least in my organization, that we found, I came out of the tech space, and data was ubiquitous. It was, to what uses were you going to mine that? One of the things that I found when I first got into the cannabis space was there was a decided lack of it. And it seems like if you're going to get to sustainable practices, that has to be a big cornerstone of it. Can you give me your thoughts on the role that data may play in sustainability, since we've got you here? And I think you're smarter than everybody else, or at least I am. So
I'm not sure about that, Dana. I think, one of the things I believe we have to agree on is just nomenclature, right? We as accountants in particular are very well suited at valuing capital assets and so on. But we're rather, we don't have the systems necessarily to value intangibles. And today, a company's value is really its IP, its brand, as much as it is its product. And when I talk about nomenclature, it's just getting the C-suite, getting the CFOs to stop talking about EBITDA and ROI and IRR, but really kind of bringing into it a way to capture sustainability metrics as well as performance. So, we both, Ira and I, actually have a strong root on the real estate side, and the evolution of how we come from the quantitative aspects of data up to the qualitative aspects of data in real estate is a really good parallel here. We started out with smart buildings or green buildings, and that was just basically wiring up the buildings so that we could start measuring and monitoring energy use, waste, airflow, if you will, things that we could measure easily. Over time, buildings needed to become not just connected, but actually smarter in terms of being able to become operationally smarter. So we moved from smart buildings to safe buildings, because now we were taking environment into account as well, earthquakes, hurricanes, terrorist attacks coming out of 9/11. Right. If last year has taught us anything, it is that we need to move from safe buildings to healthy buildings. because we weren't be able to come back into those buildings. And ultimately what is happening along this trajectory is that our trust in the product, in real estate, it's the physical asset, had to mature. And today where we're at is really looking at trusted buildings. And that to me is the piece that I'm going to call the collective ambition all of us need to have with regards to the relationship between the person and the product needs to become a trusted relationship. And in the cannabis industry, it is obviously the environmental aspect of this, from lighting to airflow to water consumption to waste to packaging and so on, and being able to measure and track that. But it is also a trusted relationship that we need to develop between, inside of the supply chain, between the supplier and the consumer. And to do that, it is absolutely, IoT every step of the way. We want to know how much air, how much electricity, how much water, down to nanotechnologies, quite honestly, right? We
Really unpack that a little bit for me.
seed to sale. I think we do a lot of RFID today, right? So we're able to track we're tracking at a certain level, but to get even more granular, I believe that the future will include some nanotechnologies, all the way down to a fingerprint of what you're shipping and what you're packaging, and that's where nano comes in. One thing is this: we don't today have the technology to measure this, to store this. And we also don't have the analytical capabilities to analyze it and do something with it. And that's also where things started in the built environment. We were really, really good at collecting vast amounts of data, and it was just kind of like, he who had the most was the winner. And we realized that it really turned out to be that she who knew what to do with it was the winner. And I
absolutely.
And I think that's my transition to Gail, because it's not collecting the data, but really figuring out how to analyze it and connect the dots from measuring sustainability to yielding performance results.
So I would say that years ago, just a couple of years ago, we were starting to see people really looking carefully at their seed control systems and their data related to production on the operational side. And what came of that is they understood a little bit more why they had to throw plants away. And to me, that is a perfect example of something that is, wasteful. It's not good for your bottom line. It's not good for your morale, and it sure isn't good for the environment. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to continue to sharpen our pencils on that front. What we're also seeing just recently, I would say within the past year, is companies more and more starting to implement enterprise resource planning solutions, or ERP solutions. And that has a profound impact on the environment, again, on the bottom line. And very often we find that they align. So if you're seeing your sales increase because you are able to market your product in a way that is truly compelling and authentic from a sustainability perspective, that's absolutely worth tracking by brand and product. And then on the cost side, it's even more interesting because you can understand a little bit more, not just your utility costs, but again, your waste and what is your cost for disposals, what is your cost for water usage, what is your training and team costs to understand how to implement sustainability practices and what are the benefits of all those. We're also seeing an evolution, and Ira alluded to this, from a regulatory perspective, that as governments get more and more involved with sustainability, I think there's going to be an imperative for companies to manage that risk from a regulatory perspective, and possibly even in places where there isn't regulations. I really do believe there's an opportunity for companies to self-regulate as far as sustainability is concerned, so that possibly the governments can see that the cannabis industry is being responsible and making good decisions, and therefore will continue to be a beacon of sustainability in the future.
And hey, Dana, if I could just interject, I'm curious,
Yeah,
Gail's
please.
thoughts in
Yeah.
particular. I mean, I sort of feel like I alluded earlier to this notion of translation. I feel like sometimes there's a translation in what Tama described, sort of taking the data and from the operational to the financial. It does feel like, and we all joke about cannabis being, dog years. And so you talked about things a long time ago, and you were referring to like 2 years. But what's interesting there is that I do feel like for those that sit in your former role as a CFO, there's so much going on. There's so much activity, so much growth, that the ability to really understand how to create that sort of pivot into some of the non-typical financial stuff and how to make that financial, and particularly in what I think will be a very active M&A year, and a year in which, Tama mentioned this notion of valuing. I'm curious how you think others sort of look at this, because it strikes me that the whole notion of M&A and how to bake this into M&A as part of your sort of long-term vision as an organization, the ability to focus on the infrastructure that's needed to do all this stuff, and the extent to which it adds literally value in the course of what your future may be, just, the where those things align or not in terms of just the role that exists for a CFO, and how to get all that in sync.
Sure. I mean, I would say from the very beginning at Forward Grow, even before we had our facility up and running, when we were constructing it and showing people throughout the facility, we constantly spoke about not just the operational, but the financial implications of growing sustainably. But then once you start operating, I think is the question, Ira, because then it gets really complicated fast, because you are just trying to get your plants out the door. And in our case, we were the first ones to get medicine to people who've been waiting for decades for this medicine, and sometimes life-saving medicine. So, I mean, what I like to recommend, and what I'm starting to see more and more of, is, management reporting, and really being thoughtful about your planning, your budgeting, and every month going through your numbers, not just your financial numbers, but your operational numbers, and looking at them together. And what you'll start to see is more and more trends. When you can see some dip in production and you see a dip in sales, and maybe there's a delay because of the cannabis life cycle, but and starting to trend that more and more, I think, is incredibly important. And what you start to do is you start at a high level, and then you get more and more granular to the point that you understand the specific strains and their production and what their growth is, and related potential waste, as you may have to destroy. In the beginning, when a lot of people are starting growing, there's a lot of challenges related to the actual cultivation process. I mean, we're growing sometimes in longitudes and latitudes that have never grown cannabis before. So everybody's figuring it out, but constantly tying those financial metrics to your operational metrics. I think we'll see a lot of the cannabis companies rise to the top who are able to do that successfully.
Yeah. That's a great point, Gail, and I'm sorry, Ira, but one of the things I'm really interested to know about, and Ira, I know you know this like the back of your hand, but cannabis, especially in the U.S., it's very different. In many cases, it's completely vertically integrated. So when you start talking about the supply chain in cannabis, it's a very singular conversation. Could you shed a little bit of light on that and your thoughts?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, I think that supply chain is one of those things that probably is true about a lot of things we've talked about in this conversation, which has multiple meanings. So if you think about it from the standpoint of literally a supply chain of the industry and the vertical integration, I think the extent to which some jurisdictions, because everything is done state by state, have certain requirements, others may have different requirements, the level at which that vertical integration creates a more efficient or effective supply chain versus literally the supply chain of how you bring products to market, and what's inherent in, for instance, cultivation that may be different in the supply chain process for retail. I think that's part of the challenge, is that the supply chain itself, what's coming from where, is often very different depending on your jurisdiction. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we face as an industry, is the inconsistency and the extent to which that may exist for a while, even if we're growing into new markets. I think there's also an element of supply chain that is in the organizational process, which is kind of almost the financial supply chain, which gets at the issues around literally how you capitalize your organization. I think there's a supply chain of capital element to this. So I'm sure Tom and Gail have lots of thoughts, but my view of the supply chain is that because there are such unique circumstances and because so much activity is out there as companies try to achieve a level of what they each consider relevance in terms of size and scale, they got to grapple with supply chains that are very, very different, while at the same time, because of the influence of stakeholders trying to move towards a level of sustainability. And I think that makes it really, really difficult. But I think that as more and more jurisdictions start to think differently about how they can align with maybe other jurisdictions, how they can create some greater ease with which the supply chain can take place, and as more companies kind of get a better sense of the jurisdictional dynamic, I think it starts to become easier. Frankly, the financial supply chain may be as complicated as anything, and that until that gets a little bit more efficient, it will be difficult, because that's where you get into how the operational elements, especially around cultivation methodologies, get more impactfully translated into the kind of outcomes financially that everybody's looking for.
Ira, I think so interesting the way you characterize the different concepts of supply chains. I think a supply chain, I think that's going to continue to change. I think in the past year, in 2020, a lot of the supply chain conversation was about cannabis companies getting their equipment from abroad, and now they can't get it because of some of the challenges related to that. And now we're talking a little bit about product and how you're getting product from your fellow licensees within your state. Well, in the future, as the borders come down through legalization and also regulatory change, and I don't have a crystal ball, so I don't know exactly what that looks like.
Come on, Gail. Everybody knows you do.
But I think that's something that people should keep their eye on, because sustainability will have an even greater impact once the borders start coming down. I mean, growing cannabis in California is very different than growing cannabis in Maryland, for example. And what implications will that be from your product supply chain? And if there's an opportunity to even bring in cannabis product internationally, then what would that look like? And I believe that the companies that have a real eye to sustainability will be able to grow more cost effectively, and that'll have supreme impact on the entire industry.
I think Gail and Ira, both of you speak of operational and financial supply chains and truly taking something that as regulations change, as borders open, is going to become global. And I'm going to quote Larry Fink of BlackRock. I mean, he literally said, sustainable, resilient, and transparent portfolios. That's where the money is going to go. And when we speak about the financial supply chain, capital markets, and the M&A activities that we all expect to be coming, sustainability will be a new standard for investing. And I'm going to add another supply chain to this, guys. I'm going to talk about the opportunity supply chain. Along the way, whether it's the physical, from the seed to sale, whether it is the financial, from startup to getting gobbled up by portfolios or going public. Along that path, we have opportunities to make sure that we're inclusive, that we're ethical, that we make those decisions. And so I believe that there's an opportunity supply chain here as well. And it is the aggregate of the small decisions we make that are truly going to create, sustainable enterprises.
So, Tom, I think it's extraordinary that you brought up the BlackRock example, because that to me is one of the fantastic epitomes that we should look at for self-regulation. My understanding is that BlackRock told the CEOs of the companies that they invest in that they will no longer invest if they didn't have a sustainability plan in place. And the CEOs very, very, very quickly goes on their very own to implement their own sustainability plan. And therefore, there's less regulation needed in that particular situation. And I think that could be even more meaningful. And if that's not an example of the financial benefit of sustainability, I'm not sure what else there is.
When money talks.
But I also think, guys, that the notion of having a plan, I think that hopefully this coalition will help establish what a plan looks like, or what the sort of baseline should be, because everybody otherwise will have potentially a very different plan. And I think some level of consistency, some standardization in at least some of the baseline goals and objectives of a plan are important, because I think that structure is going to be necessary in order to kind of take this to another level.
Yeah, I think the Larry Fink really talked about climate risk equals investment risk, and he put the onus back onto the portfolio companies and said, the gauntlet he threw down is, are you with me? Because if you're not, the money ain't flowing anymore.
Right.
So, and I think this is actually, while there's tremendous leadership coming out of BlackRock, the grassroots kind of change here has been brewing for a while, and it's a generational shift. It is a just a shift that has come along over time here, and am I laughing because when I say it's coming along, it's cannabis dog years again. It's probably a couple of years. Right? So, but as consumers today, and we've seen it especially in this past year when everything has gone direct to consumer and brand. There's been a real shift in what people are buying, how they're buying, and the loyalty to certain brands has really become more fickle. And the thing that's happening is with consumers, they're becoming smarter and they're more discerning, and they're not just looking at, hey, it's a pretty package, or it's a product a celebrity is using. They're truly asking the question of, who are you, the producer, the seller? How did you make this product?
Yep.
How do you treat your employees? How do you treat your planet? I mean, that questioning is now coming more and more into play, not just in cannabis, but across the board, whether it's apparel, whether it's food and beverage. Any brand is needing to really answer this question that BlackRock is asking, right? What is your purpose? What is your behavior?
And I think, Tama, what's interesting too, in those other areas you mentioned, those other industries, I think it ties directly to the cannabis space. I think this other aspect of sort of sustainability, this is a powerful plant. And if we think about sort of hemp versus marijuana, for instance, what if we had, hempcrete built facilities to cultivate cannabis in the most environmentally sustainable way, with solar panels on the roof and sophisticated systems that were not huge users of, whether it be energy, water, what have you, and packaging that was much more innovatively utilized. I think that's a world that would be a really interesting one. And I hope it's not that far away, frankly. And I hope that part of what the last year has taught us is to maybe put things in perspective and view things from a bit of a longer term, and hopefully take that sort of forward-thinking look at the responsibility that you alluded to at the very beginning.
What I would add is, just listening to all of you and just being in the industry myself, it seems like the cannabis space is fueled by a level of social awareness that other industries don't enjoy. So, as we end the podcast, I guess what I'd really like to hear is maybe some of your parting thoughts. I think we all feel this kind of tingle in the back of our neck that the industry is ripe for the type of evolution that you guys have been discussing. But maybe with your thoughts, maybe what does that look like kind of in the near term? And I'll shut up now. But Ira, Gail, Tom, give it to me.
So I'll start. I believe strongly that we in this incredibly successful industry are standing on the shoulders of the people before us. That's the advocates, it's the veterans, it's the Black and brown people who've been jailed more unfairly than anybody else. It's the indigenous people whose land we're growing on. And I'm very conscious of that in everything we do. I've seen that also in Cohn Reznick, and every decision they make, they're aware of whose shoulders we're standing on. And I'd like to think about things in the future, about when people look back on the decisions that we make today and they're standing on our shoulders, we need to be able to, stand tall and support the decisions we make. And that includes social justice, that includes sustainability, it includes ethical decision-making, and being thoughtful in everything we do. I feel very fortunate to be in the cannabis industry right now. I'm cognizant of our past, and I'm definitely keeping an eye on the future.
Thanks, Gail. That's
Gail, I think
that's incredibly eloquent.
Yeah. I mean, how do you follow that? The privilege we have is not lost on me. I mean, here we are, participating in this podcast for the Sustainable Cannabis Coalition, being a founding member, and with that privilege comes great, power and influence. And we definitely want to be looking back, knowing that we use that for good, right? We have an opportunity here to do more. We have an opportunity here to do better. And that's exactly what we want to be doing.
Yeah, and I would just say that I often say, working with our people and our clients, that we're having fun, but we're also taking it very, very, very seriously. So what Gail and Tama have described, the importance, the people on whose shoulders we stand, the responsibility, we take it very seriously. And you used the word, Dana, earlier in your tech experience, ubiquitous. I mean, I hope that sustainability as a concept, both the cultivation methods as well as the larger sort of social realm, as it relates to cannabis, that it becomes ubiquitous. And to everybody else's point, that we make a big enough difference to leave things in a better place than we found them.
Well said. And with that, thank you. And unfortunately, we've reached the end of our podcast. However, Tama, Ira, Gail, thanks so much for taking time to speak with us today and sharing your thoughts on sustainability within the cannabis industry, because it's such an important subject. And it's not often that listeners get a chance to hear from industry experts assembled on one podcast. And for that, we really appreciate your time. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dana.
All right.
Cheers, everyone.
Bye-bye.
So listeners, if what you heard on this episode strikes a chord, and we certainly hope it does, all of us at the SEC would encourage you to reach out to Ira Weinstein at Cohn Reznick and Gail Rand at Grand Consulting for more information. So here's what's coming up next. On our next podcast, we'll be speaking with Eamon O'Kane and Kristen Alley with Valiant America. They're one of the nation's leaders in cannabis facility build-out and consulting. They're also founding members of the SEC. So thanks again for tuning in to the Sustainable Cannabis Coalition podcast. I'm your host, Dana Hillman, and look forward to speaking with you soon.